It was a quiet evening in a small suburban town, one of those places where everyone thinks they know each other, where the streets feel safe, and trouble seems like something that happens somewhere else. But that night, trouble came knocking in the most unexpected way. Angela Carter had lived in this town for years. She was a strong, independent woman, the kind of person who carried herself with quiet confidence. She didn't start problems, but she never backed down from them either. She had raised her son, Jason, on her own, working hard to give him a life full of opportunity. What most people didn't know was that Jason had grown up to become an FBI agent, one of the best in his field. That evening, Angela had just finished grocery shopping and was walking back to her car in the dimly lit parking lot when she noticed a group of men lingering nearby. Something about the way they looked at her made her stomach tighten. She wasn't the type to get scared easily, but she knew when to trust her instincts. The men were young, loud, and full of arrogance. They had been causing trouble all over town, but no one ever seemed to hold them accountable. Maybe it was because of their family names, their connections. People turned a blind eye, pretending not to see the destruction they left behind. But Angela, she wasn't the kind to pretend. As she reached for her car door, one of them stepped forward. "Hey, lady," he said, his tone dripping with something between amusement and hostility. "You lost." Angela knew exactly what this was. It wasn't just about her being a stranger to them. It was about something deeper, something uglier. She straightened her back and met his gaze. "I know exactly where I am," she said calmly. Another guy laughed. "Well, maybe you should go somewhere else. People like you don't belong here." Angela's grip on her keys tightened. She could feel the weight of their stares, the way they surrounded her just enough to make it clear that they had no intention of letting her leave so easily. They thought she was alone. They thought she was an easy target. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Back at home, Jason had just finished a long shift. His job kept him busy, but he always made time to check in on his mom. When she didn't pick up his usual call, something felt off. He knew his mother. She was always on time, always answered, even if just to say she'd call back later. His gut told him something was wrong. Angela, standing in that parking lot, could sense the danger creeping closer. One of the men took a step forward, and she could feel the tension crackling in the air. She wasn't afraid, but she knew the situation could go south fast. And then, just when they thought they had all the power, everything changed. Because Jason was already on his way. And what those men didn't know was that the person they had just threatened, she wasn't just any woman. She was the mother of an FBI agent, and they were about to find out exactly what that meant. Angela's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had been through challenges before, and she wasn't about to show fear now. Fear gave people like this power, and she refused to hand them that satisfaction. She stood tall, her eyes steady, as the men closed in just enough to make their intentions clear. One of them smirked, tossing a glance at his friends, as if he was waiting for their approval. "Lady, I don't think you get it. This isn't your kind of town." Angela exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping her keys a little tighter. She had heard words like that before, wrapped in the same arrogance, the same belief that some people belonged while others didn't. But she had worked too hard to build her life here to let a bunch of entitled young men tell her otherwise. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a cocky grin, took another step forward. His confidence wasn't just in his size, it was in his last name. His family had lived in this town for generations. He thought that gave him ownership, that people like Angela were nothing more than outsiders passing through. "I asked you a question," he said, his voice a little sharper now. The others chuckled, watching like this was some kind of game. Angela didn't flinch. "And I already answered," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the guy's smirk faded just a little. He hadn't expected that. He was used to people backing down, avoiding trouble, hurrying away without making eye contact. But Angela wasn't most people. The second guy in the group, a little shorter but just as smug, folded his arms. Lady, you really don't get it, do you? Angela's patience was wearing thin. No, she said, tilting her head slightly. I think you're the ones who don't get it. The leader scoffed, glancing at his friends again. He was about to say something when the sound of an approaching car caught their attention. It was Jason. His black SUV rolled into the parking lot, headlights cutting through the darkness. He had driven straight from his office, his instincts screaming at him that something wasn't right. The moment he saw his mother standing in the middle of a group of men, his jaw tightened. Jason wasn't the type to make scenes. He had been trained to assess situations, to think before he acted. But seeing his mother surrounded like that, it sent a fire through his veins. The men turned as his car pulled up, their cockiness fading just a little as Jason stepped out. He wasn't in his FBI gear, no badge, no gun visible, just a tall, muscular man in a dark button-up and jeans. But there was something in the way he carried himself, the way his sharp brown eyes locked onto the group, that made them hesitate. Angela let out a quiet breath of relief, but she didn't relax just yet. Jason's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something going on here. The leader of the group hesitated for a fraction of a second before forcing a smirk back onto his face. Who's asking? Jason's expression didn't change. He had dealt with men like this before, people who thought they owned the world, who had never been told no a day in their lives. Angela spoke before Jason could. Just a misunderstanding, she said smoothly. Jason glanced at her, reading between the lines. He knew his mother. He knew she wouldn't say something like that unless she was trying to keep the situation from escalating. The leader of the group folded his arms. Yeah, no big deal. But his eyes lingered on Jason just a little too long, sizing him up. Jason stepped forward, just enough to close the distance. He didn't need to be loud, didn't need to make threats. His presence alone was enough. Then I'm sure you won't mind if my mother gets in her car and leaves, he said, his voice even. The leader let out a short laugh. Man, you don't even know what's going on. Jason's expression didn't change. I know enough. The parking lot was quiet, too quiet. Then one of the guys in the back muttered something under his breath, but Jason caught it. And just like that, he knew exactly what kind of people he was dealing with. Angela, always sharp, saw the flicker of something in Jason's eyes, something cold and calculating. She knew he was piecing things together faster than they realized. The leader gave a lazy shrug. We were just talking. No harm, no foul, right? Jason didn't move. His silence stretched just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then he gave a slow nod. That's good, he said, because I'd hate to think you made a habit of this. Something in his tone made the leader's smirk falter. Angela didn't waste another second. She opened her car door, moving smoothly, confidently. Jason stayed still, watching as she got inside. The men didn't say another word. They just stood there, eyes flicking between Jason and Angela, as that engine started. Jason stepped back toward his SUV, not turning his back on them until he was sure his mother was safely driving away. Only then did he glance at the leader one last time. Take care, he said, his voice almost too casual. Then he got into his car and pulled away, following his mother at a distance to make sure she got home safely. But as he drove, his mind was already working. These men weren't just some random group looking to cause trouble. There was something more here. And Jason wasn't about to let it go. What those men didn't realize was that they had just made a mistake, a big one. Because Jason Carter wasn't just any man. And now they had his full attention. That night, Jason sat in his apartment, staring at the dim glow of his laptop screen. His mother was safe, home like she should be, but something about the whole situation sat wrong with him. He had seen plenty of guys like that before, arrogant, reckless, dangerous in ways they didn't even fully understand. But this wasn't just about some local troublemakers trying to intimidate a woman in a parking lot. He could feel it. There was something deeper beneath the surface. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally started typing. He pulled up records, ran searches on the names he knew, checking criminal databases, local police reports, anything that might tell him more about who those men really were. It didn't take long before the pieces started falling into place. The leader, Brandon Hale. The name meant something in this town. His father owned several businesses, donated to political campaigns, and had just enough connections to keep his son out of trouble. Jason saw it all. Arrests that never led to charges, reports that were mysteriously dropped, complaints that went unanswered. Assault, vandalism, intimidation. Nothing that stuck, but enough to paint a clear picture. And then there were the others. All from similar backgrounds, all with ties to people in power. The kind of men who thought they were untouchable. Jason leaned back, rubbing his jaw. He had a choice. He could walk away, let this be nothing more than an ugly encounter, or he could dig deeper. But the moment he thought of his mother standing in that parking lot, surrounded by those men, he already knew what he was going to do. The next morning, Angela moved through her routine like nothing had happened, but Jason knew her too well. He could see the way she held herself, the way her eyes flicked toward the door a little too often. She wasn't afraid. Angela Carter was never afraid, but she was aware, more than she wanted to be. "You don't have to worry about them," Jason said as he set a cup of coffee in front of her. Angela gave him a look, a small smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Did I say I was worried?" Jason sat across from her. "No, but I know you." She took a sip, studying him over the rim of her cup. "You already started looking into them, didn't you?" Jason didn't answer right away, but she knew. Angela sighed, shaking her head. "I don't want you getting involved in something you don't need to." Jason leaned forward. "Mom, I do need to. They picked the wrong person, and they're going to do it again. Next time, it might not be someone who knows how to handle themselves." Angela tapped her fingers against the table. "And what exactly are you planning to do?" Jason exhaled slowly. "For now, just watch. See what else they're into, because I have a feeling this wasn't random." Angela held his gaze for a long moment before nodding. She knew Jason well enough to understand when his mind was set. Meanwhile, across town, Brandon Hale sat in a leather chair in his father's office, his jaw still tight from the previous night. He hadn't expected that situation to end the way it did. That guy, Angela's son, he wasn't just some regular man. There was something about the way he looked at them, something that made Brandon feel like he was the one being studied, evaluated, judged. He didn't like it. His father barely looked up from his desk. "You need to be careful, Brandon." Brandon scoffed. It was nothing. Just a little misunderstanding. His father finally glanced at him, eyes sharp. "No, it wasn't. Do you have any idea who that man is?" Brandon hesitated. "What do you mean?" His father leaned back in his chair. "Jason Carter, FBI." Brandon felt a flicker of something cold run through him, but he forced a smirk. "So what? He's just one guy." His father exhaled, shaking his head. "One guy with power. You think you're untouchable, Brandon, but men like that, they don't forget, and they don't stop." Brandon clenched his jaw. He didn't like being warned. He had spent his entire life getting away with things because of his name, because people knew better than to cross him. But this time, something was different. And he didn't like that either. Back at his apartment, Jason continued his research. The more he dug, the more connections he found. Real estate deals with suspicious backdoor agreements. Businesses under Brandon's father's name that had records of unexplained money transfers. Links to local law enforcement that made certain investigations disappear before they even started. Jason didn't just see a group of privileged men causing trouble. He saw a pattern, a network, and he had a feeling he was only scratching the surface. His phone buzzed. A message from an old contact at the bureau. "Asterisk, you're not the first one to look into them asterisk." Jason's eyes narrowed. There was more to this than he thought. And now he wasn't just looking into them because of his mother. No, it was something much bigger. And he wasn't about to stop. Jason sat in his car outside a quiet cafe, his eyes locked on his phone screen. The message from his bureau contact echoed in his mind. Asterisk, you're not the first one to look into them. Asterisk, that meant someone else had tried before. And if Jason had learned anything in his years at the FBI, it was that when people like Brandon Hale's family had something to hide, they would go to any length to keep it buried. He took a slow breath and started typing. Asterisk who else was looking into them. Asterisk, he wasn't expecting an immediate reply, but his phone buzzed almost instantly. Asterisk Detective Rivera, local PD. Went quiet 2 years ago. Asterisk. Jason's grip on his phone tightened. He knew what went quiet usually meant. Either someone had been forced into silence, or worse, made to disappear. He quickly ran a search on Rivera. The name brought up old articles, mentions of a dedicated detective investigating corruption, questioning the influence of certain families in the town. Then suddenly, the trail went cold. No further reports, no follow-ups, just gone. Jason's gut twisted. This wasn't just about a group of reckless young men causing trouble. This was a system, a web of power and control that had already taken people down. And now he had stepped right into it. Meanwhile, across town, Brandon paced inside an upscale bar, his nerves running high. His usual cocky confidence was cracking, and he hated it. The night before, his father's words had stuck with him. Jason Carter wasn't just some guy. He was a real problem, and problems like that needed to be handled. His friend Ryan leaned against the bar, watching him. "Man, you gotta let this go." Brandon shook his head. "You don't get it. He's digging. And if he keeps digging, he's gonna find things he shouldn't." Ryan frowned. "So what do we do?" Brandon clenched his jaw. "We make sure he stops." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. At that same moment, Jason pulled into a nearly abandoned parking lot outside an old precinct building. He had spent the last hour tracking down anyone who might know what happened to Detective Rivera. That's how he found his next lead, a retired officer named Tom Wilkes, who had worked closely with Rivera before he vanished from the force. Jason spotted the older man leaning against a rusted truck, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, carried too many regrets. "You Carter?" Wilkes asked as Jason approached. Jason nodded. "You worked with Rivera." Wilkes let out a tired sigh. "Yeah, until he got too close to something he shouldn't have." Jason folded his arms. "What was he investigating?" Wilkes hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a low voice, he said, "The Hales. Money laundering, backdoor deals, connections to law enforcement. Rivera was onto something big. Then, one day, he just disappeared." Jason's jaw tightened, and nobody looked for him. Wilkes let out a bitter laugh. "You think people around here were going to take on the Hales? Nobody wanted to end up like Rivera." He shook his head. "I left the force not long after that. Figured I'd rather keep my life." Jason could feel the weight of what the man wasn't saying. Whatever Rivera had found, it had cost him everything. And if Jason wasn't careful, he could be next. Before Jason could ask more, his phone buzzed. He glanced down. A text from an unknown number. "Asterisk, you're making a mistake. Walk away, asterisk." Jason stared at the message, a slow burn of anger building in his chest. Someone was watching him, and they wanted him to stop. But now there was no chance of that happening. Elsewhere, Brandon sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His father's voice rang in his ears from their earlier conversation. "Asterisk, you handle this wrong, and you'll be the next problem I have to clean up." Asterisk. Brandon wasn't stupid. He knew his father wasn't just talking about reputation. When things got messy in his family, they had a way of disappearing, just like Rivera. He didn't want to be next, but he also wasn't about to let Jason Carter ruin everything. As he stared out at the street, an idea started forming. If Jason wanted to get involved, maybe it was time to remind him what kind of town he was dealing with. Back at his apartment, Jason sat at his desk, piecing together every lead he had gathered. He had enough now to know this wasn't just about corruption, it was about control. The Hales didn't just manipulate the system, they were the system, and he had just made himself a threat. Then, a sound outside, a car pulling up. Jason's instincts flared. He moved to the window, carefully peering out. A black SUV sat idling on the street. No lights on, no movement, just watching. A warning. Jason exhaled, steadying himself. They wanted him scared. They wanted him to back down. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. And soon they were going to find out. Jason didn't move right away. He stayed by the window, watching the SUV as it sat there, silent, unmoving. A direct message. He had rattled something, pushed too far, and now they were letting him know it. He pulled his phone from his pocket and snapped a quick photo of the vehicle before stepping away from the window. He didn't need to go outside to confirm what he already knew. If they were watching him now, they had likely been watching him for a while. His movements, his research, none of it had gone unnoticed. That meant one thing. He was getting close to something they really didn't want him to find. His mind raced through possibilities. He had suspected that Brandon and his friends were nothing more than entitled men with too much protection. But this was bigger. This was orchestrated. Someone was making sure people like Rivera vanished, that investigations never saw the light of day, and that threats like Jason were silenced before they became problems. His phone buzzed in his hand. Another text from the unknown number. Last chance. Walk away. Jason exhaled, rolling his shoulders. If they thought a few threats would be enough to shake him, they were dead wrong. The next morning, Angela noticed the change in him. She didn't ask right away, but Jason could see it in the way she studied him as she sipped her coffee, her eyes sharp. I saw you checking your phone all night, she finally said. You gonna tell me what's going on? Jason sat across from her, debating how much to say. He didn't want to worry her, but Angela Carter wasn't the kind of woman who appreciated being kept in the dark. They've been watching me, he admitted. They know I'm looking into them. Angela set her cup down, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she let out a slow breath. And you're not backing down. Jason shook his head. She studied him again, then finally nodded. Then be smart about it. He gave her a small smirk. Always am. But deep down, he knew this was different. He wasn't just investigating corruption anymore. He was stepping into a fight that had already claimed victims. And if he wasn't careful, he could be next. Across town, Brandon sat in his father's office, his leg bouncing impatiently. His father leaned back in his chair, reading through a file before finally speaking. You let this get out of hand, his father said, voice calm but sharp. Now it's our problem. Brandon clenched his jaw. I can handle him. His father shook his head. No, you can't. You already tried, and now he's digging even deeper. He closed the file. We're done waiting. It's time we remind Jason Carter who really runs this town. Brandon frowned, but before he could ask what that meant, his father picked up the phone and made a single call. Jason didn't have time to wait for them to make their next move. He spent the day combing through every file, every report, trying to find something, anything, that could expose them before they had a chance to silence him. Then he found it. An old land transaction buried in records from nearly 2 decades ago. A purchase made under a shell company tied to the Hales. On paper, it looked like nothing, a forgotten business deal, but Jason recognized something in the documents. A pattern he had seen before in federal investigations. This wasn't just about money, it was about something far worse. He grabbed his phone and called Wilkes. The retired officer picked up after the second ring. Carter. I need to see you, Jason said. Now. There was a pause before Wilkes sighed. Meet me at the old diner. 20 minutes. Jason was already grabbing his keys, but as he stepped outside, he froze. His car, the tires were slashed, deep, deliberate cuts. and taped to the windshield a single note. Asterisk, you should have listened, asterisk. Jason scanned the street, his heartbeat steady but sharp. They weren't just watching him anymore. They were getting ready to make their move. And he was running out of time. Jason didn't waste a second. He turned on his heel and walked away from his car, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder. He knew how this worked. Whoever had left that note wanted to see his reaction. They wanted fear. But they weren't getting that from him. Not now. He pulled out his phone and called a rideshare. It was a risk, but he needed to get to Wilkes. The old cop had answers, and Jason was running out of time to find them. 15 minutes later, Jason stepped into the nearly empty diner, scanning the room. Wilkes sat in a back booth, a coffee in front of him, his eyes wary. Jason slid into the seat across from him, lowering his voice. "I found something," Jason said. "That land deal, 1998. The buyer was a front for the Hales." Wilkes sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Jason leaned in. "Tell me what I'm missing." Wilkes hesitated, but Jason could see the war in his eyes, the weight of years of silence pressing down on him. Finally, Wilkes exhaled and spoke. "That land, it wasn't just a business deal. There was a body buried there, a man named Daniel Clay." Jason's stomach tightened. Who was he? Wilkes' voice dropped lower. "A journalist. He was investigating the Hales. Got too close, started connecting dots. Then one day he vanished." He shook his head. "They said he left town, but I knew better. Rivera knew better too." Jason's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about money laundering or corruption. This was murder. Wilkes looked around the diner nervously. "Listen, Carter, you've already stirred the pot more than you should have. If you dig any deeper, they're not gonna just scare you. They're gonna make you disappear too." Jason sat back, his mind racing. He had enough now to blow the entire thing open. The land records, the missing journalist, Rivera's disappearance. It was all connected. But he needed proof, real proof. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. Another message. Asterisk, too late, asterisk. Jason's breath stilled. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the black SUV from the night before pull up outside the diner. Wilkes saw it too. His face went pale. "You need to leave. Now." Jason didn't argue. He pushed out of the booth and moved toward the back exit, but the moment he stepped outside, two men were already waiting for him. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, his tone almost amused. "We need to have a talk." Jason didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, catching the first man off guard with a hard elbow to the ribs. The second one moved fast, but Jason was faster. A sharp twist, a sweep of the leg, and the man hit the ground. Jason took off running. His heart pounded as he weaved through the alley, knowing they wouldn't be far behind. He needed to disappear, regroup, figure out his next move. But just as he turned a corner, a sleek black car pulled up in front of him. The back door swung open. "Get in." Jason skidded to a stop. He recognized the voice instantly, his mother. Without hesitation, he jumped in, and Angela hit the gas before he could even shut the door. He turned to her, stunned. "How did you?" Angela kept her eyes on the road. "I know you, Jason, and I know when you're in trouble." Jason exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, this is bad. They killed a man, maybe two." Angela's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. "Then we make sure they don't get away with it." Jason stared at her, then let out a small, almost disbelieving laugh. "You always told me to stay out of trouble." Angela smirked. "I said to be smart. You're not stopping now, and neither am I." Jason shook his head, a mix of tension and admiration settling in his chest. He should have known. His mother had never been one to back down from a fight. And now neither of them were running. They were going to end this. Jason sat in the passenger seat, his mind racing as Angela drove through the dark streets. The SUV from the diner was nowhere in sight, but he knew that wouldn't last long. The people after him weren't the type to give up. Angela's grip on the wheel was firm, her face calm but unreadable. Jason had always known his mother was tough, but this was different. She wasn't just protecting him, she was ready to fight. "You have a plan?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the road. Jason exhaled. "I have the pieces. A journalist who disappeared after investigating the Hales. A detective who got too close and was erased. A land deal connected to both." He shook his head. "But I don't have proof, not the kind that sticks." Angela was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're looking at this like an agent. But this isn't about just building a case, Jason. This is about exposing them." Jason frowned. "What do you mean?" Angela turned onto a quiet street and pulled the car into an underground parking garage. She cut the engine and looked at him. "People like the Hales don't just hide in paperwork. They hide in perception. They control the narrative. That's how they've gotten away with this for so long." She paused. "You don't just hit them with evidence. You hit them with the one thing they can't control." Jason's eyes narrowed. "The truth." Angela nodded. Jason leaned back, processing. If this were a normal case, he'd gather evidence, take it up the chain, and let the justice system handle it. But this wasn't normal. The Hales had influence, control. Even if he handed everything over to the authorities, there was no guarantee it wouldn't disappear before it ever saw the light of day. He needed to go public. Jason reached for his phone and made a call. Wilkes picked up after a single ring. "Carter." "I need everything you have on Rivera and Clay," Jason said. "And I need it now." Wilkes hesitated. "You sure about this?" "Once you do this, there's no turning back." Jason glanced at his mother. She gave him a nod, her expression unwavering. "I'm sure," Jason said. Wilkes sighed. "All right, meet me in an hour." Jason hung up. Angela was already pulling up something on her phone. "I have a friend," she said. "She runs an independent news site. No corporate ties, no one to pull the plug. If you give her this story, she'll run it." Jason was impressed. "You've been thinking about this for a while, haven't you?" Angela smirked. "I know my son." An hour later, Jason met Wilkes in a desolate parking lot on the outskirts of town. The old cop looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying this weight for too long. "I dug up what I could," Wilkes said, handing over a flash drive. "Rivera kept records, notes, voice memos. It's not everything, but it's enough to show the pattern." Jason took the drive, gripping it tightly. "Thank you." Wilkes nodded. "Just make sure it doesn't disappear like everything else." Jason wasn't going to let that happen. Back in Angela's apartment, they worked through the night. They compiled documents, traced the connections, lined up every piece of evidence so there were no loose ends. Then Jason made the call to Angela's journalist friend. The woman, Lisa Powell, listened carefully as Jason laid everything out. When he finished, there was a long silence. "Send me everything," Lisa finally said. "This is big, Carter. You sure you're ready for what comes next?" Jason took a deep breath. "I'm ready." The article dropped the next morning. It spread like wildfire. A powerful family accused of covering up disappearances, manipulating law enforcement, silencing anyone who got too close. The public backlash was immediate. News stations picked up the story. Social media exploded. People started demanding answers. Jason knew the Hales would try to fight back, but the damage was already done. By midday, federal agents arrived in town. Not just to investigate, but to take action. Brandon Hale was arrested first. Conspiracy, obstruction, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of Daniel Clay. His father, Richard Hale, was next, charged with corruption, bribery, and tampering with law enforcement. More arrests followed. Officers who had buried reports. Judges who had dismissed cases. The entire foundation the Hales had built was crumbling. Jason watched it all unfold from Angela's apartment, the news playing on the TV. He should have felt victorious, but instead he just felt relieved. It was over. Angela sat beside him, watching the screen. "You did it," she said. Jason exhaled. "We did it." She smiled, then nudged him. "You know they'll make a movie about this one day." Jason chuckled. "Yeah, well, let's hope they get a good actor." Angela laughed, and for the first time in days, Jason felt the tension lift. There was still work to do. More hearings, more trials. But the Hales' grip on the town was broken, and that was enough. As the sun set, Jason stood by the window, watching the city lights. He had spent years chasing justice, but this time it had been personal. And he had won.